I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. My guests today are Mike Kuiken and Josh Hodges, two members of the congressionally appointed U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. We discuss the nature of the China challenge and the recommendations made in the Commission's annual report, which was just published on November 18th. I hope you enjoy the episode. Mike and Josh, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us. Good to be with you, Peter.
Let's start by trying to figure out why we are here today, what the occasion is. So you are both commissioners in something called the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission that was appointed by Congress. Can you tell us a little bit about it? When was it appointed? What is its purpose? Who is its audience?
Commission was created about 25 years ago, Peter. In fact, I think next year is actually the 25th anniversary of the commission. And it was right around the time of China's accession to the WTO and the debate in Congress about permanent normal trade relations with China. And I did like a little bit of alleged history on this when I joined the commission. The story is fascinating in that congressional leaders in Congress at the time decided they didn't trust sort of two entities. One was China and the other was the executive branch. And the task was basically keep an eye on both. And sort of how is the relationship building after PNTR and after WTO session, and then just keep an eye on it on an ongoing basis. We do an annual report every year and then have a series of recommendations that accompany that report as well. So that's the history of the commission, and that's sort of the primary product that we have come out every year. There's also 6 hearings usually that we do on a variety of topics and engagements with the executive branch and a variety of other officials that come through Washington.
How often is the composition of the commission changed?
So the way the commission exists is that the 4 congressional leaders each get 3 appointees. Each appointee is there for a 2-year term. Some people stick around for just 2 years and then rotate off, and there's some folks that stay on for a number of years and stick around. And I think right now it's and Josh should check me on this, I think it's mostly a mix of folks that have been around for a while and some new folks that have been coming in.
Yeah, that's right.
So how long have each of you been doing this? And if you could just provide your personal background with China, how long you've been working on China, and how has your relationship to China changed over time?
I was appointed in April of this year, and before this I was in Speaker Johnson's office. Mike Johnson, who's in charge of the House, I was his national security advisor for the past year and a half. He brought me in right when he was elected Speaker of the House. Before that I was with the National Security Council under the first Trump administration, focusing on the Western Hemisphere. And one of the things that I did when I was in that office was put a spotlight on China, kind of expose the hidden hand of all their activity in the Western Hemisphere, from Canada down to South America and the Caribbean. And since then, it's just been increasing focus. Obviously, did some work when I was on the Hill before that over in the Senate related to China, as well as when I was over at the National Nuclear Security Administration, that really kind of opened my eyes to how fast China was closing the gap to catch up to the United States on a series of critical capabilities.
I spent 23 years on Capitol Hill, 3 years in a personal office for a senator named Carl Levin. And then I moved over to his Armed Services Committee staff in 2004, spent 12 and a half years there, and then 7.5 years with Majority Leader Schumer. His first day on the job as the Democratic leader in 2017 was my first day on the job as his national security advisor. And China's been something that's been a thread that has sort of continued to get sort of pulled through my career, whether it was on the Armed Services Committee or Leader Schumer's office.
I didn't know we both had that in common, being there the first day. That's quite the wake-up call.
This commission has existed for almost 25 years, you said. The United States' relationship to China has changed dramatically during that period. For the past number of years, China has been described as a pressing problem, a pacing threat, I think was one term of art. So this report that is coming out on the 18th, right, certainly describes China as a problem for the United States across a variety of dimensions. So could each of you explain what sort of problem China poses to the United States in broad terms, and then perhaps identify the most pressing challenge as far as you're concerned? So, Josh, perhaps you could start.
Yeah. So, look, one of the reasons this kind of gets back to your original question, one of the reasons I wanted to join the commission when I left the speaker's office was I really do think the commission has done a good job over the years of highlighting things that are going on now and things that are going wrong that need to be addressed. And I think the work it's done over the past couple of years has been really essential to driving the conversation and for serving as sort of a good bipartisan discussion on everything China's doing. And I think the report this year continues that trend. It shows that the Communist Party of China is not just seeking to dominate in one critical area, that they are focusing on core technologies that they view as essential for their future in order to have a chokehold on the United States and the international sort of world order. And that ranges from AI to computing power to biotechnology and to military equipment. And so it's something that the commission has focused on in the past. It's something that I think a lot of folks in DC and across the United States are starting to wake up to. And we repeatedly heard from witnesses throughout the year that have provided evidence that they're looking to replicate their supply chain chokehold in other emerging tech areas. And so one of my big sort of messages to people all year long has been pay more attention to China and what they're doing, because for a long time, it kind of felt like folks were, they talking the talk, but not actually making the rubber meet the road when it came to action. My hope is that with some of the events that have unfolded this year, people will really wake up and realize this is something we've got to take seriously. And that ranges from individual people to American businesses and policymakers.
But what does that mean specifically? Because it sounds a bit strange in DC to be calling on people to pay more attention to China. It seems like there is no conversation that ever omits China. And you said that there's a lot of talk, but maybe not a lot of action. So given how much talk there is, how would you direct action? What is the particular threat that China poses, and where should we start in dealing with it?
So I think the threat part is broader than the what we can do about it question. I think China right now poses a threat to us here domestically at home. I think they pose a threat to us internationally, and I think that they pose a threat to us from a U.S. standing perspective. What I mean by that is they are right now taking steps in order to cripple us in 2 to 3 years from having any manufacturing being able to be done here in the United States. And that's why I'm happy to see the renewed emphasis on being able to have a production line here in the United States, agnostic of what the technology is. On the threat piece, I really do think a lot of folks, even though it is a regular sort of thing to talk about in DC and internationally to a growing extent, I was in Europe last year with some members of Congress, and I was kind of taken aback at one point whenever I had recommended to one of them, hey, you should really talk about the importance of having Europe follow suit on American actions. And they kind of all stopped and looked at it. They're like, why would we talk about China while we're in Europe? And that to me was a little bit of a wake up that like, we really need to have people who are better educated on how this all ties together. Well, part of the reason I was interested to come talk to you today is I think your sort of position where you're looking at Russia and China and how those overlap is vitally important. And I think too many people right now are looking at the China problem from a business perspective. They view this as business competition, not economic statecraft, not competition that potentially could lead to some type of conflict. And I don't think that's the way China's viewing it. I think they're viewing it in much more real terms and national security terms. But I think it's something the United States really needs to wake up to.
But so it is a challenge across the board, interlocking geographically, thematically. Mike, how would you answer this question? Is there a particular domain that concerns you most? And also maybe if you could date it, like is there a period in these last 25 years when you decided that China was suddenly a problem?
Let me answer the original question first, Peter, and then I'll come around to that one. So the thing that drives me the most, having existed in Washington for however many years, is when we constantly try to brand something. So whether it's adversary, competitor, enemy, frenemy, pacing threat, persistent focus, stay due gap, all these sort of Washington hot takes drive me insane. So like I don't want to put a word on it. The way I think about it is that China has done an incredible job of saying that they're going to do something and then doing it in the sort of technological strategic competition space. And I think that folks in Washington too often see these things that come out of Beijing as aspirational documents, not actually sort of marching orders and plans. And so that's my sort of reaction to your original question. On the question you asked me of like, when was my light bulb moment? My light bulb moment was really 2017 when I took a trip actually out here to California in Silicon Valley area. And I sort of heard two stories. One, all of the incredible work that the innovation ecosystem is doing out here and throughout the United States. And then two, just how much of it was also happening in China, almost at a pace that was equal to what we were seeing in Silicon Valley. In a lot of places, there's just more money. So it was moving faster in Silicon Valley. And so the Chinese have done a lot to overcome the money issue. But the other thing that I learned about out here was just how active the Chinese services were in terms of building relationships, taking intellectual property, and building themselves into the ecosystem so that they could benefit from all the innovation that was happening out here. So 2017, at least for me, was really a light bulb moment. And there were a lot of things that happened in 2017. Obviously, President Trump was newly elected at the time. One of the things I worked on is sanctions with respect to Huawei. And then the other thing was sort of CFIUS reform, because that was another area where we had learned an incredible amount about how our ecosystem had been getting leveraged against us in the competition space.
Yeah, and Peter, I would say kind of around that same time frame. In 2018, I was at an NSA, and I remember sitting in a briefing, and I guess this was maybe early 2019, with everything China had done the year before, making significant strides in its militech, specifically related to hypersonic missiles, and then what they were looking to do, leveraging AI into their naval capabilities and aerospace modernization. And then fast forward about a year and a half, and I was over at USAID. And this kind of ties into what Mike was just saying that jogged my memory is I was in a briefing focusing on the Western Hem and hearing from folks down in South America at what China was doing at the subnational level to infiltrate and get CCP operatives in order to change outcomes in 5 years' time. They weren't looking to change legislation that year. They weren't aiming at the federal level. They were really looking to do things at subnational level in order so that in 5 years they would have people in place to do things, and it would look like it was an organic movement by the people in that country. And so again, both of those things struck me as, from the technology military capability side, they are rapidly advancing. And then from the human, sort of whatever you want to deem it, they are working this with a view to the future, not from a what are we accomplishing this year, but what are we going to accomplish in 5 years' time that's going to benefit us and put the United States on its heels.
So I'm trying to clarify in what sense China is a problem, and part of this is sort of the ideological versus realist analytical framework. So the report, I read in advance the copy, uses quite morally charged language. Throughout, it is China doing bad thing X, Y, and Z. But another way to read what is happening, or to understand what you two have just described, is that China is increasing its power across any number of domains. So is the problem principally one of relative power, or is there truly a claim that this is in some sense a nefarious actor that is doing morally bad things that we disapprove of in absolute terms? Mike, you can start. That chuckle, I think, is not sufficient in its own to answer the question.
I mean, listen, it's a great question, and you're trying to put your finger on us, which I always love because that's something I usually try to do to people. The way I think about it, Peter, is they're certainly trying to acquire power, and they have been very clear-eyed and plain-spoken that this is their intent, right? So let's just answer your question straight up. I think the United States rightly views this as a country that is trying to displace the United States in the democratic world after 80 plus years of democratic primacy in this space. And we should see that as a threat. Now, going back to the first question of like, what word do we put on that? I refuse to buy into these Washington think tank terms. No offense for both the think tanks. I recognize that, Peter.
Although you did just use a term, one version of many, because there's like free world, liberal order. You called it democratic world.
Oh my God, did I use
China,
blog terms, Peter?
Well, it's hard to escape them. That's not the point.
Yeah.
The point is that China is challenging the democratic world, or whatever synonym we would like to use, in that is a problem fundamentally for the United States. But it seems that for the last 6 months, we Americans have also decided that the liberal order doesn't quite suit our needs, isn't exactly fit for purpose, and perhaps should be entirely discarded or dismantled. What's the problem in that regard?
All right, I'll jump in here, Mike. So I guess two parts. First, your original question on sort of the increase in its power, and is that relatively bad given all things considered? Again, this isn't a question of sort of they are increasing their business competition or they're increasing their military capabilities. This is a matter of values, and oftentimes we, in the policy world, forget they're actively building their market and their capabilities on the backs of slave labor, and they are doing it with the intent of having global domination. Their 5-year plans, or I guess their 14th 5-year plan, spells out that they want to leverage the international trade and investment climate in order to position China to be able to be the dominant player. If the United States had language that was anywhere near the language they had in that plan, there would be an international uproar against the United States and UN resolutions condemning us for that type of language. And yet China does it almost on a monthly basis, and no one really raises eyebrows about it. And so I appreciate your question. On the second part of your...
Wait, I need to push back on that slightly, because if we go beyond the bounds of the West, the democratic world, whatever you want to call it, there is a widely shared belief that the United States has long made such claims about its role in the world, that it is the sole purveyor of power, that it is the rightful possessor of primacy, and that it is the ultimate determinant of global order. And of course, it is described in slightly different terms than the Chinese, but the Chinese also often use fairly benign formulations when describing global initiative X, Y, and Z.
A couple of the phrases you use really jump out at me. Global order and balance. Those are the two that the U.S. typically focuses on. Those are not the ones that the CCP focus on. They want chokeholds, they want domination, they want global reliance on the Chinese market. Those are definitely different than...
Wasn't there a book that just came out, published by a former Obama official, literally called Choke Points? And the idea is that the United States needs to identify these choke points ahead of time, ensure mastery over them in order to prevent bad actors such as Russia, China, Iran, and so forth from being able to escape essentially our control, that we would like to have leverage over these international actors.
You're talking about a former official, not a CCP state document. And I also think the point, I don't know, I haven't read the book, but I've seen a summary of it. I think it's talking about identify those areas to ensure that we don't have an over-reliance on China and those vectors.
How about the Axis of Autocracy? There is a chapter that bears that name. What is this? We've been talking about China. China poses a threat because it is increasingly powerful. It is trying to unseat the United States. It is challenging the democratic world. So is there something that sort of is the antagonist to the democratic world called the Axis of Autocracy? What is its logic? Who is it made up of?
We did have a hearing. That was the title, Peter. And usually the purposes of the hearings are mostly to sort of shine a light on an issue, not necessarily to sort of drive any particular storyline. And for this particular hearing, the idea was to basically show and tell the story about the relationship between China and some of the sort of key countries that share their views. The countries that we focused on, I believe, for the hearing were North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And so that was the sort of story behind that hearing. And I think the biggest thread for me that came out was just the deepening of the relationships between all four countries and how they have almost interlocking relationships now and how those are really changing and morphing, especially sort of post-Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that was the takeaway that I had in sort of the theme of the hearing.
I hadn't been appointed to the commission yet when they held that hearing, but this is an issue that I worked on very closely last year when I was in the speaker's office. And the reason is because increasingly as time went on, we saw more and more interconnectedness between the axis you talked about and the war in Ukraine. And we saw sort of the Chinese providing economic support, technology support to the Russians. A lot of this has now been made public. And it's, again, as more time goes by, more and more people are aware of exactly what China has been doing to support Russia's war against Ukraine, which is ultimately, depending on what side of that you fall, threatening peace and larger widespread stability in Europe. There's also evidence to support, it's been a while since I looked at it, but there's evidence to support that there were ties as well to Iran and to some of the Middle East activity that happened in early 2023. And so it's absolutely something that is concerning. It's something that I think more and more evidence continues to be made public about it.
But can you share some details with us? What is it that China is doing to support Russia that is particularly concerning, other than increasing, obviously, its trade with Russia, which seems a natural consequence of Russia losing many of its Western trading partners?
So you're saying that it's natural for countries to increase their trade with a country that's gone to war with another country?
I'm saying that in the global economy, if a massive country suddenly is denied access to its primary markets, it will seek to sell its goods elsewhere. So you can make a moral judgment about this. But the fact that as Russia's trade with Europe declined, its trade with China and India increased does not seem to be sort of on its face a surprising fact.
Well, I don't think it's surprising. You're right about that. The other thing we've seen them do is supplying dual-use military products, different types of circuitry that are used for drone components that are increasingly necessary for Russia's war against Ukraine. We've seen, I think there have been public reports about potential intelligence sharing. So again, I think there's more than enough publicly available information that demonstrates China's done more than just sort of economic support by buying goods from Russia.
I don't dispute that at all, and we don't need to make this an argument. We're going to move on to another subject soon, but just in terms of dual-use technology, circuits, and so forth, I just came from lunch with a Ukrainian, and my understanding is that drones are the most important military technology on both sides at the moment, and that the components for the drones that each side assembles are Chinese. So that technology is going to both sides of this conflict. That initially, both the Ukrainians and the Russians were just buying ready-made commercial Chinese drones. Now they assemble their own drones out of Chinese parts, so that there is a strange symmetry in that respect, and that the most important military technology is actually going to both sides.
Strange indeed.
Yeah, there's also the shadow fleet issue, Peter, which is the same ships that historically have enabled Iranian oil trade are now enabling Russian oil trade. And the Chinese financial institutions are sort of actively facilitating this. There's obviously the facilitation of drones that we've already sort of talked about. And then obviously China's purchase of Iranian oil is something that we're seeing incredible spikes in. And those are all issues that sort of got highlighted during the course of that hearing.
And if we're going to talk about shadow fleet and purchases of oil, India obviously is not part of this axis, is often called the world's largest democracy, but nonetheless, for clear economic reasons and in pursuit of national interest, they are also purchasing Russian oil, enabling the shadow fleet. So is this a categorically different sort of relationship? Does it seem like perhaps India may decrease its purchases in real terms? I mean, we've heard headlines to that effect, but it seems like they've been pretty good at using a number of intervening layers in order to get the oil, whether directly or some other way.
Yeah, I'm not sure of all the dynamics with respect to India. That's obviously a sort of a current event, or an issue that's being currently debated between the White House and in India. So I don't know exactly where things stand. At the hearing, obviously, it did come up, but not as a data point that we focused a great deal of time on.
I was just wondering if there's sort of a qualitative difference in this respect between what China is doing and what India is doing.
I mean, is there a qualitative difference? I generally wouldn't take all of the terms that we talked about earlier, adversary, competitor, enemy, frenemy, pacing, threat, or anything like that, and apply them to India. So I would certainly say that there is a qualitative difference. I'm not sure if you would necessarily agree, but I would certainly say there is.
I would also add to that, again, I think it's not sort of just a one-off. I think if you look at it in totality of everything that the Chinese are doing, then that's kind of where I don't want to call it a dividing line. If the Indians were to ask me, I'd recommend that they stop engaging on the sort of the energy sales. But I think it's everything kind of combined together.
So to take the other two members of this axis, the report talks about how neither Russia nor China supported Iran much at all or terribly actively during the 12-day standoff with Israel. And then the Chinese and Russian relationship with North Korea seems to, in some sense, be competitive. I understand that in the report, there is an admission that this is an axis or coalition that exists to advance the interests of each party for its own selfish reasons. But so then again, what is the point of looking at them all together? Like, one piece of evidence that China has a special relationship with these three countries is that it's top trading partner, but it is the top trading partner for much of the world. It is very active in Latin America, as you, Josh, mentioned. So again, I'm just curious about why these four countries fit together in some special unit.
Peter, you unfortunately have two commissioners, neither of which were the co-chair of this hearing. My colleagues, Aaron Freeberg and John Stivers, actually co-chaired this hearing. But as I understood their sort of objective behind this hearing, it was basically like, how do we tell the story about China's deepening of its relations with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the interdependencies that they are increasingly having as a result of the war in Ukraine. I think the hearing did a good job on that. I think you obviously gone through some of the things that we talk about in the report. Obviously, North Korea sending service members to Russia is obviously a dramatic change. The strategic hedge that China makes with respect to North Korea for a potential Taiwan contingency in the future is like a real thing. And it's something that I think we highlighted in the report. The oil trade that goes around between these nations at discounted prices, I'm sure, is a story that we told. The efforts of the Chinese and the Russians to build parallel financial systems that are designed, or at least designed with the intent of undermining the US dollar and the global economy, is a story that we effectively told. The drone ecosystem, which you sort of talked about how there's a little bit of both sidisms going on here, is a story that we were able to tell. Not the both sides part of it, but the incredible reliance of the Russians on Chinese parts for their defense industrial base was a story that we were able to tell. I think the commission did a good job of highlighting these issues. People might disagree on the sort of the value, calling it the axis of autocracy or telling the story the way we did, but I think that was the objective of the hearing. And I think the folks that testified before us did a good job.
All right. Well, fair enough. Or at least it seemed to me that this was one of the important frameworks within which the challenge was perceived. It's in the introduction. It's the first substantive chapter after the initial chapters that describe the year that has just passed. It resonated quite clearly with the Biden era global division between democracy and autocracy, which provides, again, a conceptual framework for perceiving the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China. So I was curious to what extent that is how you guys see the problem. And has there been movement away from this overarching framework associated with the previous administration? Because it seems that the current one not only doesn't espouse that particular worldview, but in many respects actively rejects it.
I think it would be a misnomer to suggest that it was a Biden-led effort to identify the sort of China-led axis related to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I mean, these are known adversaries of the United States for a long time, definitely going back 10, 15 years. I can think of half a dozen different documents that have identified them as such. And so I think what happened in 2024 was you saw, and I'm thinking now of a speech Speaker Johnson gave where he actually said, he characterized it sort of a China-led axis working to undermine the United States and peace internationally. And so that's what I think it goes beyond trade. And in your earlier question, you kind of put this in the context of trade. And I think that fails to really encompass everything China is doing. Yes, they are large trading partners. They're large trading partners to a lot of nations. That's, I think, fine. What we also see is as China works with these countries, they're providing them with technology, they're providing them with resources, sometimes they're providing them with intelligence, sometimes they're providing them with ammunition, sometimes they're providing them with critical minerals and chemical precursors for explosives to carry out acts that have a negative impact on the international stage, as well as to those countries adjacent to where they are. And so I think this isn't just a Biden administration, sort of continuation of any Biden administration sort of position. This is a bipartisan, in fact, I think 235 Republicans voted for something for the supplemental last year that actually called this out. And then I think a majority of Republican senators did in the Senate as well. And so I think it would be a misnomer to paint this as a Biden administration policy. I think this was a bipartisan policy and bipartisan recognition that China is acting nefariously internationally, and there are a group of countries working with it to further destabilize the international order and peace.
Right. And I didn't mean to say that that division of the world was not bipartisan, but I do think that in terms of administration, there has been a clear departure from the dominant frame that used to exist that was put into the national security strategy, which was democracy versus autocracy, with China and Russia being the central elements in the autocratic axis. And the new approach where national interest, pragmatic relations are at least in theory possible with all other states, including Russia and China and North Korea. Perhaps this hasn't worked out, but the administration has certainly made attempts in the name of advancing American national interest and has also seemed to stress linkages less. So the idea that the war in Ukraine bears directly on a contingency in Taiwan seems to be less of an emphasis now than it was before. But we don't need to pursue this line of inquiry too far since it doesn't bear directly
the
on
only thing I would, as sort of a reminder, both to you and the sort of listeners, is the objective of the commission is our client is Congress. And our job is to sort of look at China and to tell the story about sort of where we see the key areas of competition. So we have the fortune of not having to get into the politics of one administration versus the other, and rather just look at the sort of China piece of the story, thing one. And then thing two, I would just say, you read through the report.
I like how we've gotten to Dr. Seuss. It was getting contentious before, but Dr. Seuss and thing one, thing two always adds a little bit of levity.
Yeah. And then the other thing I would just pile on is that the commission has a long history of producing a consensus-based report. And so all 12 commissioners sign on to it on a consensus basis. And it's always sort of like a negotiation that happens within the commission to get to a place of consensus, because no one wants a lowest common denominator product, and no one wants us to sort of get on the extremist train. So that's sort of the reaction I had as I was just listening to you in that commentary, that we're fortunate enough not to have to sort of get into that, like, whose version of the global order is winning in any given moment. The job is tell us what China's doing, tell us how you evaluate that problem, and give us ideas on how we can sort of march forward from a U.S. policy perspective to sort of enter into that, either with a dialogue or conversation or debate or threat matrix conversation on the various issues.
Well, unless Josh has something to add to this particular subject, perhaps we could move on to the marching orders. Like, what then do you 12 commissioners propose that the United States should do in order to confront these many challenges that China poses?
One of the areas that I've been spending a lot of time on since I left government, Peter, is biotech. And I was actually just in Paris last week at an international conference called IGEM, and Josh was actually with me there. And it's an area where I think the commission for 2 years now, and the National Security Emerging Biotech Commission as well, have said this is an area of incredible competition. And so we have a recommendation on that included in the report. We also have a recommendation with respect to quantum. This is an area where the commission spent a little bit of time last year and had a recommendation with respect to vertical integration and with sort of our countries that are aligned with us. And this year went a little further after really taking a close look at this issue. So quantum is another area. And obviously, quantum and biotech, in my view, and you might not agree with this, Peter, are area where there's some sort of incredible first mover advantage. So if you think about the opportunity of quantum, whether it's sort of the convergence of quantum and AI or quantum and scientific research in AI, there's real opportunity there. And then in biotech, the group of countries that unlock biotechnologies and general purpose technology will have an enduring advantage. And so, the United States largely did it with respect to physics in the sort of the Manhattan Project. And this is an area where the commission highlighted another area of competition.
To add to that, I think one of the messages of the report, in my opinion, is the United States needs to prioritize innovation and show that the United States can still lead. Because the Chinese have, for a number of years, had this message out there that China is winning, the United States is falling behind. And what we've done with this report is we're showing they're seeking to do that, and we're showing the critical areas they're seeking to do that in. AI, computing, Mike mentioned biotechnology, a few others. because they really are seeking to prioritize that and actually make it a reality. We are still absolutely, the United States is still absolutely the leading innovator of the world. And yes, the Chinese have some great technology and there's some great places for people who visit China to visit. Absolutely. But we've heard from numerous witnesses throughout the year, and as we've toured the country and heard from experts, both in the IC as well as from the business community, is that the Chinese are looking to replicate their supply chain chokeholds in other new emerging technology markets. I met a few weeks ago with a leading sort of U.S. specialty chemicals company, or actually a few different companies, who shared the sort of how China is rapidly rising. The number of Chinese imported chemicals is rapidly rising. And it's making American companies' abilities to compete even harder, because it's not just about, oh, China's competing now, oh, the American companies don't want it. It's the Chinese come in with subsidies. They come in with a different bandwidth, and so they're able to outcompete, not because they have a better product, but because they have lower costs. That is running some American companies into the ground, trying to keep up with that. It's not better for the consumer. And in 5 or 10 years, probably shorter than that, one of them said it's probably within the next 2 years, if it continues to go this direction, the United States is going to lose its ability to have major manufacturing goods produced here in the United States. Chemicals for everyday products, from pharmaceuticals to agriculture to clean water. Even one company said, we're going to lose the ability to make tires here in the United States if things don't change. So it really does run the gamut and show sort of the scale China is doing this at. And so that's why I think it's absolutely fair for us to be focusing on in the report, because we've got to show the world the United States, can continue to compete and lead. We can continue to innovate. To Mike's point, we've got to prioritize those investments. We've got to prioritize that the U.S. government is actually making it possible for universities and institutions to do that work and to keep people engaged.
And so, other than investment internally, how important are tariffs, the building of some larger coalition that would all act in accordance economically in order to confront China's subsidizing of its market at scale?
Yeah. So I think what you saw initially with the Trump administration was they came in, but before they got in, they recognized the system right now is not structured for the United States to win. It's structured for the United States to allow other countries to catch up. And they wanted to take some steps to very rapidly turn that on its head. And we should have a system that, again, we are working for a wide-scale benefit for everyone's benefit, but where the United States is in the lead. And that's something I think that, as an American, I support. I think the United States has done a lot of good for the world. Yeah, so I think that coming in, that was sort of the initial effort. I think you're starting to see the ground starting to settle a little bit now after that major tilling, but I think there are good things in store.
And Peter, to just do talk about the third recommendation I wanted to make sure we touched on, which is consolidating various entities in the executive branch. So the thing that I sort of heard Josh saying without saying it explicitly is like the United States government at all times should use all of the available tools that it has to it to sort of persuade, cajole, deter countries that we view as a pacing threat or an adversary or a competitor or frenemy or whatever terminology you want to stick on it. So, President Trump, whether you agree with him or not, has decided that tariffs are especially effective. But there are a lot of other tools that we have, and you see some of them came up with President Xi last week, export controls. There are obviously sanctions that we've leveraged against Russia and China in some cases. And so the one thing that doesn't exist right now in the executive branch is a place where all of these sort of tools are consolidated. And so one of the other, I think it was the number 1 or number 2 recommendations of the commission this year was that we recommend Congress do essentially a review of the various sort of entities that have equities in this space and consider consolidating them into sort of an economic statecraft-like institution. And so that was one of the big recommendations we had this year. And it's something that we did to a sort of a limited degree in sort of the post-9/11 era when we consolidated and empowered the sanctions community from the Office of Foreign Asset Control and made sure that the Treasury Department was part of the intelligence community. And the idea there was basically to make sure that you had the ability of the sanctions folks to reach into the intelligence community and get actionable information. And so I think we're really now at a point where we need to think about almost hitting the refresh key in this economic statecraft ecosystem and think about export controls, tariffs, sanctions, and some of these other tools of economic statecraft to consolidate into a single entity. Mostly because, unfortunately, these things are in different departments and agencies, and too often it becomes just sort of like an interagency morass that is more interested in process than decisions. And so that's the motivation behind that particular recommendation.
And so this is about providing effective instruments for the United States to create leverage, for example, in anticipation of some trade deal. So China creates export controls on rare earths, we would have a weapon to respond with. Or this is more about punitive sanctions that would be levied against like Russia and then applied to China to weaken Russia? Or is it all sort of part of the same picture?
I think that's the negative side of the coin. That's the stick. If you look at the carrot is, this is also about the interagency working together in a much better sort of clip to create a U.S. ecosystem that can thrive, where innovation actually has a place to go. And so it's working with international companies to get U.S. products out of the United States into emerging markets. It's to get leading companies that aren't American to buy American equipment to take it overseas. I mentioned earlier the Chinese ability to come in with subsidies whenever there's a competition with local companies in some emerging markets. One of the other things that the Chinese are very good at is being fast. I talked to the CEO of a company who operates overseas. He said, I spent a year talking to the DFC, wasn't really sure we were making any progress. It was kind of the same conversation I had on day 2 of us meeting. And within a couple of months of talking to the Chinese, we had what we needed. And so that, I think, is an example of the U.S. interagency not moving fast enough, not being nimble enough. Again, this is the carrot side, working with companies in a positive way, whether that's cutting regulation, whether that's working with foreign governments because there's foreign regulations that are impeding the companies from going in or operating there, whether it's concerns with a lot of businesses. One of their main concerns is, can we actually operate on a balanced playing field in these foreign markets? State Department of Commerce can help those businesses mitigate and manage some of that concern and some of those risks in order to go in and compete. That's good for American business. It's good for American products. It's not just about money. It's about having everyone working towards the same goal, which is promoting American business. That's what these organizations were established for, right? Then to your point, yes, if there's a country if there's a shadow fleet operating, that's when you can look at sanctions. If there's I don't think any exist, but sort of Chinese company that's not a flagged Chinese company operating in a third, I'm joking, there's thousands of them internationally that operate in third-party countries that are truly a Chinese-owned company, but just don't say that they are. Those are things that the U.S. government should know about, that American businesses should know about, that the international community and those local governments should know about, right? And so I think it's getting easier with the internet to identify that type of stuff, but it's still something the U.S. government has struggled with.
Can you be a bit more specific about the carrots? Because I didn't quite understand in concrete terms what this governmental entity would be able to do to create better conditions for American business abroad. So if you could just sort of draw a picture for us in a particular place,
right now,
kind of business.
Yeah, of course. So right now there are multiple different entities. So there's the Development Finance Corporation, there's the U.S. Export-Import Bank, then there's the Department of Commerce, and they all have similar roles but very different roles. And so one thing I've found, and again, I worked at the National Security Council, I worked with these entities on a regular basis, they don't play well with each other. In part that's because the people are trying to control their pot of money and their turf. Some of it is also just because of the way they were stood up. Some of them were stood up, for example, the DFC is limited in financing opportunities in countries that are high income. And so that is a specific limitation they have, but they're very slow to turn something over to the Exim Bank or the Department of Commerce to find an alternative. And so trying to speed that up would be one sort of direct rifle shot, easy to understand kind of tool. Another one would be, if there's financing, if the Chinese are offering financing from a company, but it all can't come from DFC or Exim Bank, is there a sort of joint venture that could be undertaken to make it more competitive, the financing more competitive? And so that's one. The other is just the due diligence process. And a lot of times there's years of due diligence that has to be done in order for the U.S. government to engage with a company overseas. That time frame should be brought down. That can be brought down by actually having enough people staffing these positions to actually do the work. Department of Treasury is a great example. Since earlier you brought up sanctions, oftentimes there aren't enough sanctions staff to do the legwork. And so one of the things we've advocated for is there, given sort of the new tools with AI, can AI be used to help those staff that do exist, the billets that do exist, to do more work? Or is there an opportunity to actually increase some of those billet numbers? So again, those are questions for the administration to take, but those are the types of sort of reforms that I think are necessary in order to to modernize the USG.
Well, making American business more competitive abroad, I think, is absolutely a positive goal, and one that probably we would be motivated to achieve whether China was there or not. But China's presence, I suppose, is a good incentive. What other recommendations does the report make, just for the final 5-10 minutes, make sure that we hit all of them?
So another one we haven't talked about, I think we briefly touched on it, is space. And so the space is absolutely an area where the Chinese are making major strides and seeking to close sort of the U.S. competitive advantage. This has global implications, just given the nature of space, but it's also got direct national security implications for the United States, whether it's telecom, whether it's just protecting the air over our heads. But this is an area where we've made a recommendation for the USG to actually, we've got Space Command, but to actually look at China as a near-peer competitor and to put resources necessary to stay ahead of them.
The only other one I'd throw in there, Peter, is scam centers. Obviously not the theme of your podcast, but an area where the commission has put a lot of work into it. And it's an area where we've really been trying to sort of raise awareness. We had a chance to visit a couple of countries in Southeast Asia this year, and all of us were just totally taken aback by the scale of these scam centers in Southeast Asia and how it's a murky sort of story to tell about like what the Chinese relationship is exactly with these scam centers. But there's definitely something going on there. Thing one. And then the other piece of it would be this thing too, since you like Dr. Zeus, is that it's incredible how these scam centers are using advanced technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's voice modulation tools, whether it's sort of like things that make all of us look like incredibly attractive women, various tools like that to sort of go after their victims. The Economist did a good piece on this. And then a piece on this as well. We've done a report on this, and it's an area where, again, looking at the threat, looking at how our government's currently organized, and looking at how this is like almost fitting in the sort of gray zone of international crime. It was another area that we called some attention to this year in our top 10.
Well, luckily, I have not been the subject of a scam attempt from Myanmar, but you never know. It's nice not to have that sword dangling over my head if you guys can eliminate it. So the question is, what can be done about these giant scam farms in Southeast Asia?
I mean, the simple answer, Peter, is I don't think I totally have a good answer for you. So I'm going to disappoint my host a little bit. But one thing that is incredibly clear is that the victims of these scams are often unaware of where they're coming from. And so where do they report the crime that's been committed against them? 2, how do we let them know that there's an ecosystem of people that actually want to help them potentially get their money back? So it's raising awareness. I think sometimes people hear public service announcements and roll their eyes, but sometimes they are incredibly useful to sort of make sure people that are victims know where to go. And then this is also like not a failure of our system, but sort of a gap in our system where the crime is happening at a super local level, right? A farmer in Iowa or a person in Oklahoma or a person in Michigan. And so like, who do I call? Do I call like 911? Do I call 311? Do I call my local police department? Do I call the FBI? Like, does the FBI give a damn if I got my money taken? So it's like one of these things where we're not necessarily organized in a way that makes it easy for people to know where to go. So the recommendation that we had was like, you got to think about how we organize U.S. law enforcement to think about this in a new and thoughtful way. And then honestly, how do we work with foreign partners that are also eager to slow this down or end this kind of crime? So I think we tried to take a swing at some ideas in this space. And I think it's an issue that we're going to continue looking at in the coming years.
Well, you mentioned foreign partners. So to finish, can you guys give a breakdown of what kind of international partnerships are necessary to produce the results that you desire? Is it sort of a consolidated West? Is it existing military alliances in one place or another, or is it dependent entirely on the problem? And so when it comes to space, we have certain partners. When it comes to scam centers, we have others.
I do think it's a unified effort. And I think, to be honest, I think it's all of the above. We take it where we can get it. And one example of this is one of the recommendations of the commission last year, or maybe it was the year before, was on addressing U.S. financing of Chinese companies and sort of what's termed sort of outbound investment. And I remember talking to the Europeans, because I was looking at this through kind of a skeptical lens and thinking like, is this really going to make a dent, or are things just going to get shifted and then they're going to go to sort of European investment? Like, how can this actually be done? And what the answer I finally kind of landed on was, okay, this can have a meaningful impact, to help the United States to slow down the military growth in China. And again, this is investments to non-military means, but it had, given the dual use nature of a lot of technology, there were sort of benefits to the military. And what I landed on was, okay, if the United States and Europe act on this, it can have a significant impact on Chinese military capabilities over the course of the next several years. But we have to do something, not together, but we both have to act, and it has to be measurable and meaningful. And when I talked to the EU about this, I was told, we'll do something when Congress passes a law. Because at the time, the Biden administration had an executive order. And they said, no, we need an actual law that can't just be changed every 4 years. And so that's an example of clear, like if Europe and the United States acted together, we would have meaningful impact. In other areas, I think it varies, right? In some cases related to space, yes, we could have definite benefit with just a few different countries acting, but in others, we're going to need everyone to kind of act together.
But you said that when you went to Europe recently, you did not find great receptivity to this message. Is there a sense of how to describe it as a common challenge in order to get the Europeans on board? Because they're obviously in dire straits economically, many of the bigger countries in Europe, and they're facing pressures from all sides. Yep. And asking them to give up China relations. The
meeting that I was referencing was in 2024. I was just there a couple of weeks ago, and the message was, I had done not a 180, but definitely they had taken several steps forward. Everyone from sort of NATO to the EU to individual nations are now, they recognize what China is doing related to the war in Ukraine, as well as the other aspects that they're doing a little bit below the surface, undersea cables and just different things. And so Europe has woken up to this. Again, not quite fully. I still think a few countries need to wake up, and I'm apprehensive to see kind of what happens out of the upcoming French president's visit to China, but I think that they've definitely made improvements.
But what have the most effective arguments been in your experience? So you mentioned China's support for Russia in Ukraine. Is that the issue that gets the European attention the most?
I'd actually zoom out on this question, Peter, a little bit. Your question sort of looks backwards. Let's look forwards for a moment. Anytime you're building or maintaining a coalition, it's work. It doesn't come for free. It's not easy to do. And a lot of it is sort of situation dependent. So the way I always think about it is, Josh said, you got to sort of pick all of the above approach. And I think that's what you have to pick at all times. And whether it's Europe or India or some other Western partner or American partner someplace, you just have to be prepared to sort of meet them where they are, see what their needs are, and have that conversation. I think that's a sort of a more forward way of thinking about it. I think right now the Europeans are certainly interested in talking about Ukraine. That may not be the case in 6 or 9 months, and we're going to have to sort of meet them where they are then. I hope it's still the case that if Putin has not left Ukraine, that it's still front of mind for them. And so that's how I think about it. When I was in the Senate, it was always about coalition building too. How do you get to 60 votes, right? And sometimes you can get members there just by asking, and sometimes you can get members there by having sort of a hard conversation. And so it's no different with our sort of European partners. And that's how I sort of think about it.
One thing I'll add there, I agree with all of that. What can't be the conversation is, if you take these steps, we will give you X. It's got to be like, you're doing this because you recognize the long-term value for doing the right thing and for having a fair and balanced international system.
So we're not going to give them a big pot of gold. We're going to give them your report, and that will be terribly convincing. They will all get on board.
I mean, I want to give a pot of gold to everybody.
Well, the Irish are allies, and they've got leprechauns, so we can ask them to pull their weight.
Love some leprechauns and Lucky Charms.
Wonderful. Well, Josh and Mike, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.